Boss fights. Not every game has them, but damn are they fun. The boss, or bosses, of a game serve a few different important purposes in a lot of games. They act as the main antagonist, which drives us to beat the story. They offer some really fun and challenging gameplay, and often help to round off certain areas, or give a climactic ending to an adventure. A boss battle is, of course, a fight against either the main antagonist of the game, or another enemy that is unique, and much stronger than any of the other enemies that you'll find while playing. Oftentimes, these battles will be a defining part of the game, either giving these satisfying conclusions, or giving the game a sort of lackluster feeling. I've still yet to play Cuphead, but literally everything I've seen of the game are its boss fights, where you'll be going up against some of these awesome and iconic bosses, and this, to me, highlights just how important they are to a lot of games. Now, depending on the game, the boss might have a bunch of different attack patterns for you to avoid, a huge health bar, or number of times needed to be hit, weak points for you to target, or a creative way of being defeated. But the important thing is that it's challenging, it's engaging you, it's not gonna die to a few fireballs ideally. And in many cases, they can act as this glue, which keeps the narrative and gameplay intertwined. Big bad boss is big and bad, I must defeat this level and put an end to it. So these boss fights are overall pretty damn important for a lot of games, which also means it's really important to get right. What are the things that makes boss fights underwhelming or annoying? What exactly is it that makes them fun to begin with? What makes a good boss battle? As with almost every game, the main goal is to be fun, and the boss fight is no exception. In fact, this should realistically be one of the most fun and rewarding parts of the entire experience, because it's what you've just spent the entire game working towards. And arguably, the most fun part of a boss fight are the actual fighting mechanics. These mechanics should feel interesting and satisfying to use, so that the fight has an overall exciting and rewarding feel to it. When I say mechanics, the main things I'm talking about are how you can defeat the boss. So maybe that's through finding weak spots to hit, or dashing through them, or doing something a bit more creative and entirely based around the boss's design. And also, the boss's attacks. Oftentimes this will be a variety of moves that they cycle through, but sometimes it can be something as simple as running straight at you. It's important for both of these mechanics to feel different from boss to boss, as well as them being creative and fun in some way. Otherwise, it can make the boss feel a little bit dull and boring, which effectively makes fighting it more of a chore than the exciting experience that it should be. One series that is a bit infamous for having some lackluster fights is the new Super Mario Bros. Series, where you'll have quite a few boss battles throughout each game. The problem is though, there just isn't really any excitement behind most of these fights. The main way to beat them is by jumping on their head a few times. In most cases, you just entirely ignore their normal attacks, and at times, it's literally the same fucking fight over and over again, with absolutely minimal changes. There are definitely some outliers. Some of the Bowser fights are absolutely leagues ahead of everything else. And you know what? Fuck it. Some of the Koopaling fights are actually pretty cool too. And the main reason for this are that these fights actually try and do something a little bit different, instead of just having one guy bounce around in an arena. We're not just looking to weave in some jumps, or run past him. We have actual unique mechanics here, and it feels like much more of a fight than it does a slightly bigger obstacle than usual. Unfortunately though, in terms of the new Soup series, the majority of the bosses will be repetitive, forgettable, and in some cases, an annoyance more than a fun experience. When comparing this to the 3D Mario titles, it's honestly night and day, because here I think the boss fights have a good chance to shine. Taking a look at Super Mario Galaxy, there are a whole bunch of bosses that feel really unique, and have completely different fighting mechanics. One of the first you'll find is Dino Piranha, which acts as a bit of an introduction to how boss fights will work in this game. You have to use the spin mechanic to hit its tail, and he will progressively get more and more upset. I mean, you did just give him a premature birth. I know I'd be upset. And because of this, he will become more erratic, and generally harder as the fight goes on. Not every boss in this game is an absolute shining star. Some are just fine, but some are extremely fun to fight against, to the point where there's a little bit of sadness when you do kill them. King Caliente, Megaleg, and Bouldergeist are three of my favourites because of how they feel like more than just avoiding an attack then weaving yours in. You're putting up much more of an active fight, all while trying to escape death. And the important part, none of these share any of the same mechanics with one another. They're all entirely unique. A boss fight should also feel like a bit of an exam, which is there to test you on what you've learned while playing through the level. It Takes Two's boss battles will have you going up against all sorts of creatures and objects. Each one will be related to the area that you've just gotten through, and you have to use what you've learned to beat them. For example, to defeat the toolbox, you will need to use your hammer and nails to either let May swing across, or to throw Cody high up in the sky. These are the very same mechanics that you've just been practicing throughout the rest of the level, and now everything can come together in one great battle. The Portal games are another great example of this, especially because the entire game is based around testing you, so it's fitting that this final fight is like the ultimate test, which lets you bring everything you've learned about momentum, portals, and projectiles to come and beat GLaDOS. When you end up defeating a boss using their own game mechanics from their levels, it just gives you this amazing feeling of mastery over the game. It's now in your hands, and you're taking control of things to win. When fighting a boss, especially a final or main boss, you want there to be a lot of weight and gravity to the fight to really give it that epic feeling. And most games will do this naturally, just by having an antagonist in some form, but I feel a game that does this better than most others is Borderlands 2. Now, Borderlands 2 has a load of different bosses to face, and a lot of them are pretty awesome, and have some good build up to them. But obviously, none can even come close to comparing to Pretty Boy himself, who has spent the entire fucking game taunting you, making fun of you, and trying to kill you. Basically, every interaction with him is pure gold, mind you, and I think the best part about playing the game is when he pops up with something new to say. But it's also building his character into one that you desperately want to face, which just makes the boss fight 10 times more fun, and the payoff is just incredible. Borderlands 2 spends so much of its time building up the world around you, and the majority of it is revolving around Jack. So when you face him, and the warrior, you're going in with so much knowledge about his character, and about what he's done. So when he says this,
"Once Lilith here charges the key, I'll control the warrior and wipe you bandits off my planet. When you get to hell, tell your Vault Hunter friends I said hey."
Every fibre in your body is reared up and ready to fight him. After his last-ditch effort of summoning the warrior fails, his entire character falls apart in a fit of rage and disbelief, and man, does it feel good. Another game that does this really well, but in a bit of a different way, is Celeste. Celeste is a game that heavily focuses on the mental health struggles of its protagonist, Madeline, to the point where they physically manifest into another character, who has been nicknamed Badeline by the community so much now that it might as well be canon. Badeline first appears in Chapter 2, where we meet her creepily sitting across from a skeleton. Initially, she tries to convince us that this is a bad idea, and that we can't handle climbing a mountain. Essentially, the thoughts and doubts that Madeline has always struggled with. Eventually, she will say, "Let's go home, together." And this is the part where we literally have to escape these sorts of self-doubts, as she will chase us through the rest of the chapter. This is a brilliant introduction to a character like this, and throughout the entire game, Badeline will meddle with things, and continue to try and destroy Madeline's self-confidence, and stop her from climbing the mountain. But it all starts to come to a head when we try and confront this other side of us, telling her that we're going to set her free from us. And, guess what? She doesn't like it. We then get thrown down the mountain, which serves as this huge setback, considering the aim is to reach the summit, which wasn't down here last I checked. And after all of this build-up, we reach the main boss fight, and my god, what a fight it is. Unlike the majority of boss battles, this one is actually us trying to help the antagonist, while she fights us and runs away. We have to keep making our way towards her, avoiding her attacks, platforming using what we've learned, all while one of the best boss fight songs plays in the background. My god, I love this fight. The major thing that makes this fight different to the Handsome Jack fight is that we aren't meant to hate Badeline by this point in the same way we do for Jack. Sure, throughout the game, she's been this obvious antagonist that we don't align with, and for most of the game, we do actually dislike her. But I think by this point, we've started to see the cracks in her armour, and we can understand that she's scared. She doesn't want to be abandoned, and all of this is the mental health stuff lashing out. We don't want to kill her like we do with Jack. We want to help her and resolve this, and we do. After finally reaching her, she gives in, and we can learn to work together. What's awesome about this is that we aren't even close to finishing the game by this point, and can now work together to finish the rest of our journey with our extra abilities and powers. Another way of building boss fights up can also be with the levels leading up to it. In Galaxy, the final level, Bowser's Galaxy Reactor, is what leads up to that final fight. Like we mentioned earlier, it is absolutely jam-packed with elements from the rest of the game, which helps it in being such an amazing final level. The level has so many difficult parts that, honestly, it might just be as hard as the actual final fight is. And so when you do finish it, it makes that final boss fight all the more exciting because you've just been playing what already feels like a love letter to the other galaxies in the game. Now you get the ultimate battle. A boss battle should be a challenge, not necessarily the hardest one in the world. You know, an intro boss shouldn't immediately stump you as much as they're meant to ease you into the game a little bit. But a boss fight often acts as a bit of a milestone in a game, usually when you've beaten a world or a section. A boss fight shouldn't feel like you're essentially fighting a slightly beefier version of the same old enemies that you've just been kicking the shit out of, because what would be the point in that? There should be a bit of a bump in difficulty to set them apart. One of the best ways of doing this is to, again, make the boss feel unique by giving it its own mechanics and attacks and so on. But also, if it's the boss of, let's say, the first world, the levels in that world are going to likely feel like a 1 or a 2 out of 10 in terms of difficulty. So let's make the boss fight something like a 3 or a 4, so that, in comparison to what we've just faced, it feels like more of a challenge. Maybe this means giving it more health, or making it slightly faster to test our reflexes, or giving us a bullet hell experience. A lot of roguelikes do this pretty well. Into the Gungeon or the Binding of Isaac, for example, will have set things that potentially appear on each floor, which helps with setting the difficulty. So on the first floor, you probably won't find anything too scary, though you'll probably also have fuck all equipment to even that out. But when you fight one of the bosses that can appear on that floor, it will definitely feel like a bit of a step up. Then once you go to the next floor, basically every enemy is going to feel harder than the ones you were used to. In some cases, some rooms can feel just as tough as the previous boss. But if the RNG gods have smiled upon you, you'll have gotten good enough gear to face them, only to be faced with an even greater challenge with that floor's boss. Risk of Rain 2 does this a little differently, because the difficulty directly corresponds with the amount of time that you've spent on that run. But the same principle applies in that the bosses serve as a bump in skill to truly test you, and almost prepare you for the next stage. An important thing with challenge in a boss fight is that it should never feel unfair. This is something that Borderlands 2 can sometimes suffer with if you're underleveled, because you will struggle so much more, and honestly whenever I've played through the story, this can get kind of annoying because it feels like you have no chance at all to actually beat it in this case. But most of the time, so long as you're playing as intended, this shouldn't be a huge problem since you'll be killing thousands of bandits along the way. But this isn't to say that every boss fight should be beatable for every player first time. Sure, it should be possible for you to go in completely blind and figure it out quickly and win, but for the majority of players, that isn't going to happen. And honestly, it's more rewarding to lose the first time, and then start to get the hang of it the more you attempt the fight, as you learn its attack patterns, what its animations connote, how to dodge things properly, and what the best strategy for attacking it is. Celeste is, again, a good example of this, because you're going to die over and over again, literally thousands of times, and respawn in the blink of an eye to try again. So, of course, the boss fight is exactly the same. You're gonna get hit, you're gonna die again and again, but you're gonna get better and progress all the same. It's completely possible to do it without dying first try, but the likelihood is that you won't. And if you can, I'm fairly sure there's a Red Bull sponsor in there for you somewhere. So none of the deaths feel unfair because of this. While you don't really need them as often as you do regular bosses, a mini-boss can often do a lot of the same things in what feels like a slightly less intense situation. Ideally, a mini-boss fight should feel like a bit of a stepping stone from a normal level of gameplay to a harder level of gameplay that comes just before the actual boss. Again, this is the whole challenge point, just to a lesser scale. It Takes Two has a couple of mini-bosses, a fair few of them being during the wasp section of the game, where you'll fight against different specific wasps that are definitely much stronger than the regular wasps, but nowhere near as strong as the Queen boss fight. These act as a really great challenge to fully hone the mechanics of the area, ready for the proper fight, without being too much of a jump in difficulty. Another great use for them though, is how they can help push the narrative in the right direction. For example, the shield wasp acts as the barrier between us getting into the vault area, which is where we can find the hive. It would just be odd for there to be nothing that stops us here, and narratively, it wouldn't make a lot of sense. But we also can't have a proper boss fight here because we're too close to having the actual boss fight of that area. So, bada bing bada boom, mini boss. There really isn't much need for anything grand and exciting when it comes to mini bosses, and honestly, that's for the best, because you wouldn't want to overshadow your actual boss. Plus, too many big scary fights can oddly become repetitive and take away the excitement. So a lot of the time, you'll see those mid-sized enemies that are much stronger than grunts, but couldn't compare to the actual boss at all. And because of this, it's nice when a mini-boss drops something useful, but maybe not anything as fancy as a boss drop item or a treasure item. The Binding of Isaac does this quite well. You'll encounter some mini-bosses that you're then forced to fight, and they won't be the hardest fight in the world compared to the actual bosses, but they will put up one hell of a fight compared to normal enemies. So after killing them, it's pretty nice to get something like a key or a bunch of hearts as a reward for fighting them. A game that, again, doesn't really do too well in this department is the new Soup series. I swear they're good games, just don't play them for the boss fights. At the end of the mini castles, you'll get a mini boss fight, and the majority of the time, it's just going to be something that we feel like we didn't need to see. In the first entry, it was Bowser Jr. every time. And yeah, he'd change things up a bit, but ultimately, the fight plays out the same every time. And considering the bosses in this game are all unique designs, and do tend to have their own fighting mechanics, it's weird, and maybe even more dull, that this fight doesn't manage to evolve much as we go on. By the time we get to NSMBU Deluxe, we have this wanker, who does change each time we see him, and gives us a taste of the world's main boss fights in terms of mechanics. But there is zero reason for it to be him each time instead of a different enemy. That could be designed to give a better fight overall and fit in thematically with that world. Each genre will handle boss battles differently to one another. A story-rich game like Celeste or Borderlands are absolutely going to thrive off of that build-up leading to the boss fight, which means that the fight can play out in a much more intense way due to everything we've learnt about the characters. Whereas a game like Risk of Rain 2 is just going to completely avoid that sort of story and build-up because the game just isn't going for that. The sandbox genre is quite a unique one when it comes to boss fights. Because they exist, you can do them, but there isn't really anything forcing you to do them if you don't want to. And so oftentimes, you'll have a bunch of different boss fights that are available and scattered in different places in those worlds. Terraria has bosses that exist in certain areas that you'll end up finding if you go to them, but also some that can spawn once certain criteria are met. These work great because you do have some choice of whether you want to fight them, but if you want to progress in the game, there will be a chance of them showing up, which just works within that sandbox nature of the game. Minecraft is a bit different in this regard, where you do have to go and find those bosses for yourself if you want to fight them. The Ender Dragon being the main boss, that requires a lot of different things to be done before you can get to the end. And while it's a pretty cool fight, there aren't really the highest stakes in fighting it unless you're in hardcore mode, because you're usually fully prepared and in a different dimension, so I'm definitely a bit more torn on this one. A boss fight should realistically serve the game, rather than the other way around. If a game's strengths come with its randomness elements, like a roguelike, then having a predetermined boss would go against that, and ultimately lose a lot of what makes it so cool and exciting to go up against. It Takes Two really does thrive on this philosophy. Every single boss fight is playing around that game's main gimmick, in that it's a two-player game. This means that there is usually a two-step process in defeating it at all times. So when battling the Hive Queen, one player has to spray sap in the areas that need destroying, while the other has to ignite that sap to blow it up. Having a system where just shooting it with the fire to hurt it would essentially make one player completely useless during the fight, and having both of them be able to hurt it independently would go against the entire message of the game. And so, the boss fight has to fit in around the rest of the game here. Boss battles are extremely important to whatever game they're a part of. They can act as a narrative device, a challenge for the player, and a fantastic conclusion to an adventure. But there are also so many things that it needs to get right, from the mechanics, to the build-up, to the fight actually fitting in with the game. And when one of these things are done badly, it can honestly severely damage the reputation of, well, of an entire damn series of games. But generally, if the game is good, the boss battle is usually going to be good as well. Which is great, because more often than not, the boss battle is one of the defining parts of the game. When I think of Borderlands 2, I think of Handsome Jack and his fight. When I listen to the Celeste soundtrack, I get so pumped listening to that boss fight music. And while playing any roguelike, the most exciting part is easily the boss battles of each stage. When I think boss fight, I think excitement, challenge, anticipation, and payoff, because that, to me, is what makes a good boss battle.